Hey, before we dive into Richard Kuklinski's chilling story, don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoy crime documentaries like this. Subscribe to our channel for more stories, and comment below where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Now, let's dive into the life of one of the most terrifying figures in the criminal world, the Iceman. Richard Kuklinski's life began in a world shaped by fear, violence, and the harsh realities of growing up in a broken home. Born in 1935 in the heart of Jersey City, Richard was just a child when he learned the true meaning of survival. His father, Stanley, was a violent alcoholic who had little patience for his children, especially Richard. His mother, Anna, was a stern woman who believed in harsh discipline. Love was a foreign concept in their home. For Richard, it was simple: you either fought back, or you became a victim. Richard was a quiet kid. He wasn't the kind of boy who ran with the others, making noise and drawing attention to himself. Instead, he watched. He observed. He learned that the key to surviving in his world was never to show weakness. Never to let anyone see fear. And the easiest way to ensure that was to make sure others were afraid of you first. In the early years, his practice was on animals. Small creatures, easy to overpower. They didn't fight back, and they didn't tell anyone. But Richard didn't feel remorse. For him, it was a lesson in power. The more control he gained over the animals, the more control he felt he could wield over the world around him. This would become a recurring theme throughout his life: the need to control, to dominate, to feel invincible. His violence wasn't just confined to animals. As Richard grew, so did his need for power, and that power, in his world, was measured by how much you could hurt others. By the time Richard was a teenager, he had already become known in his neighborhood as someone not to be messed with. The older boys learned quickly that Richard was different. He wasn't like them. He wasn't afraid to fight, but more importantly, he wasn't afraid to end it quickly, to end it decisively. And then there were the moments when Richard knew something even darker was forming inside of him. His first real taste of murder came when he was asked to dispose of a body for a local gangster. At first, it seemed like a simple task: get rid of a problem. But Richard's experience wasn't just about getting rid of a body. It was the cold, efficient way he did it. No emotion. No hesitation. Just a job. As he learned more about the criminal world, Richard became increasingly comfortable with this life, one where power was the only currency. He quickly realized that the underworld was a place where fear wasn't just an advantage, it was a necessity. If you wanted to survive, you needed to make sure that no one could ever feel safe around you. And if they feared you, they would leave you alone. But there was another side to Richard's work, one that he hadn't fully understood yet. The deeper he went, the more his emotions became twisted. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was becoming part of a machine that ran on violence. It wasn't long before Richard's name started circulating. Whispers. Rumors. They called him the Iceman. The name didn't come from his coldness as much as it came from his ability to kill without any trace of emotion. His reputation grew quickly, and soon, Richard found himself working for some of the most dangerous men in the criminal world. But that was just the beginning. Richard didn't know it yet, but this world, the world of mafia families, hidden deals, and cold-blooded murder, was going to be his future. A future he would shape on his own terms, with a cold, unflinching hand. Richard's reputation as a killer only grew stronger as he made a name for himself in the criminal underworld. He wasn't just another thug, he was a professional. A man who could handle anything. And for Richard, that distinction was important. The world he entered was filled with men who had a similar hunger for power, but Richard was different. He didn't want to be a boss. He didn't want to run a crew. He just wanted control, and he knew the best way to get it was through fear. The jobs came in quickly, and they weren't always glamorous. Richard was hired for a variety of tasks: eliminating rivals, handling disputes, making people disappear without a trace. The work was steady, and the money was good, but it was the coldness of it all that kept him moving forward. There was something almost comforting about the clean efficiency of it. When he killed, it wasn't personal. It wasn't emotional. It was a job, one that required precision and care, and Richard was always careful. His first real break came when he was approached by a man who worked in the higher echelons of the Mafia. This wasn't some small-time mobster who needed someone taken care of. This was a man who could offer Richard something more. A steady stream of work. The kind of work that would cement Richard's place in the world he had always wanted to dominate. The first big job came without warning. A rival boss had crossed the wrong people, and a solution was needed. Richard was chosen because he was efficient, silent, and, most importantly, expendable. He wasn't part of any family. He didn't have connections to anyone. He was just a hired hand, and that made him valuable to those who needed someone who wouldn't raise suspicion. The job itself was as cold and clinical as Richard had come to expect. No hesitation. No unnecessary drama. He didn't need to know why. He didn't care about the backstory. He was just there to do the work. And when the job was finished, Richard simply walked away, leaving the body behind like it was just another piece of garbage. To him, it was the only way to survive. Kill without emotion. Kill without remorse. Soon, Richard was working more and more with the Mafia families, each job making him more feared, more respected. It wasn't long before his name was spoken in the same breath as some of the biggest mobsters in the world. He became known as the Iceman, a figure who could take out anyone, anywhere, without ever leaving a trace. He was more than just a hitman. He was a legend in the making. But even as his fame grew, so did the danger. Richard was smart enough to understand that the more people feared him, the more enemies he would make. He had seen it before, men who got too powerful, too cocky, and suddenly, they were the ones who found themselves on the wrong end of a contract. So, Richard kept his head down. He didn't seek the spotlight. He stayed in the shadows, just like the predator he was. Still, even with his careful nature, the world around him was starting to change. The Mafia was shifting, and with the old guard weakening, new, younger criminals were emerging. These weren't men like Richard, cold, calculating, and detached. They were reckless, eager to prove themselves. They didn't care about the old rules. They wanted quick, flashy power, and that kind of ambition was dangerous. Richard could feel it. The underworld was becoming more unpredictable, and in this business, unpredictability meant danger. For a time, Richard thought he was untouchable. He had lived his life with a cool detachment, never letting emotions get in the way. But as the new generation of criminals rose to power, he realized that even his cold professionalism couldn't shield him from the chaos they brought. They weren't afraid to make enemies, to break the rules, to stir up trouble. And Richard, the Iceman, found himself caught between two worlds, one where the old ways still held power, and one where the rules had been rewritten. But Richard didn't worry. He was still the best at what he did, and the work kept coming. He knew that he had only one thing to do: keep moving, stay silent, and never look back. It wasn't personal. It was just business. The Iceman wasn't in the business of making friends, and that was the way he liked it. The more people feared him, the safer he felt. Yet, as he stood on the precipice of his next big job, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that things were starting to change. The danger was closing in, but Richard had lived his entire life with danger as his constant companion. He had learned to live with it, to control it, to make it his own. And as he prepared for the next contract, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his choices. The Iceman had become a name, a legend, a symbol of cold, ruthless efficiency. But even the coldest killers are vulnerable. Even the Iceman was beginning to feel the cracks in his carefully constructed world. By the mid-1980s, Richard Kuklinski had become a living legend in the criminal world. His name was spoken in hushed tones, a symbol of death and efficiency. The Iceman, they called him. A man who could make a problem disappear with no trace, no sign of struggle, and no emotion. His reputation had spread far beyond Jersey City, far beyond the reaches of the Mafia families that had once been his sole employers. Now, criminals from all walks of life sought him out, desperate for the kind of cold precision only Richard could provide. But as the jobs increased, so did the danger. Richard had always known that his lifestyle, his chosen profession, came with a risk, but he had never expected things to unravel the way they did. The old ways of the Mafia, the codes of silence and loyalty, were beginning to fall apart. New players were entering the game, reckless men with too much ambition and not enough sense. They were younger, faster, and less cautious than the men Richard had worked with in the past. They wanted everything now: money, power, respect. And they weren't afraid to use violence to get it. This new breed of criminals didn't follow the rules that Richard had lived by. They didn't understand that in the underworld, discretion was everything. They took risks, made noise, and stirred up chaos. And as much as Richard tried to stay detached from it all, he couldn't help but feel the pressure building around him. His world, once a carefully crafted balance of cold calculation, was starting to feel like a powder keg ready to explode. The worst part of it all wasn't the risk from the new criminals. It was the fear that he was becoming a liability to the very people who had once trusted him. The Mafia families were changing, too. The old bosses were dying off or getting locked up, and the new generation didn't care for tradition. Loyalty was no longer a valued currency in the world Richard inhabited. The more they feared him, the less they trusted him. And in the Mafia, when you lost trust, you became expendable. One evening, after a job well done, Richard sat in his car, the engine idling in the quiet of a dark street. He'd just taken out another target, another man who had crossed the wrong people. It was a clean kill. No witnesses. No blood on his hands. But as he sat there, waiting for the adrenaline to fade, something felt off. There was a nagging sensation in the back of his mind, an unease he couldn't shake. He had killed dozens of people in his life, but this time, it was different. He wasn't scared. He wasn't nervous. But there was something about this job, this contract, that didn't sit right. Richard had always been meticulous, cautious, but now, as he sat in that car, he realized he was starting to second-guess himself. The law had been breathing down his neck for years, but now it felt closer. The world around him was no longer predictable. The Mafia families were shifting, and the new wave of criminals was making more noise than ever. But the most troubling thing was the realization that Richard wasn't as untouchable as he had once believed. His control was slipping, and with it, his sense of self. The call came in a few days later, a job from a contact he had known for years. But this time, there was no direct briefing. No face-to-face meeting. Just a phone call and vague instructions. Something about the tone of the man's voice made Richard uneasy. Still, he agreed to take the job. He didn't know it yet, but this would be the job that would push him into a corner. The target was a man named Dominic Polifron, a new player in the drug trade who had angered the wrong people. Polifron had been careless, and someone wanted him silenced. Richard wasn't given the details, just a location, and a simple request: take care of him. But as Richard prepared for the hit, the tension grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When he arrived at the location, an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city, it wasn't what he expected. The room was too quiet. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally. It was a setup. Richard knew it the moment he stepped inside. The trap had been laid for him. Before he could react, the doors slammed shut behind him, and in an instant, he was surrounded by men, armed, dangerous, and clearly working for someone who had wanted Richard gone. The betrayal hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the job anymore. It was about survival. The Iceman had been set up, and now, for the first time in years, Richard was the one who was vulnerable. He fought back with everything he had. He wasn't a man who surrendered, and he wasn't about to start now. But even Richard knew that this situation was different. The world he had spent decades controlling was beginning to collapse. The old ways no longer applied. He had become a relic, an old ghost, and the world had moved on without him. In the chaos of the moment, Richard made his escape, leaving behind the bloodshed and confusion. But the message was clear: the underworld was no longer a place where he could operate freely. He had become a liability. The Iceman, the ghost who had once moved unseen through the shadows, was now being hunted. The walls, once so distant, were closing in fast, and Richard didn't know how much longer he could keep running. The tension in Richard Kuklinski's life reached a breaking point after that close call. The days of operating with the cold, efficient precision that had made him a legend were over. For the first time in years, Richard felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him, and for the first time, he was forced to confront the fact that the life he had built for himself, the one where he was untouchable, feared by all, was starting to slip through his fingers. The near ambush had shaken him. His reputation, once built on a foundation of silence and control, had become a double-edged sword. Richard had always known that being feared was a powerful tool, but now, it seemed like a liability. The younger generation of criminals, eager to make their mark, had no respect for the old rules of the game. They didn't understand the value of discretion, of subtlety. They wanted power now, not in the slow, patient way Richard had learned to acquire it. They were reckless, and their ambition was putting everyone at risk, including Richard. For weeks after the ambush, Richard found himself more isolated. He didn't trust anyone anymore. The people he had worked with for years were starting to look at him differently. Some had already begun to question his loyalty, even though he had never been loyal to anyone but himself. They were beginning to see him as an obstacle, a man who had outlived his usefulness. In the underworld, that was the kiss of death. Still, Richard couldn't stop working. It was all he knew. The money was too good, the power too intoxicating. But the danger was no longer just from the law or his enemies, it was from within his own world. The Mafia families, the very people who had once relied on him, were now turning on each other. Power struggles, betrayals, and shifting allegiances were tearing the underworld apart, and Richard had become a part of that chaos, whether he liked it or not. But even as the tension mounted, Richard didn't back down. He wasn't the type of man to show fear. He had always prided himself on his ability to stay calm, to stay in control, no matter what. But now, he found himself looking over his shoulder more often, wondering if the next job would be his last. He had become a man marked by his own success, a man who had done his job too well for too long. And in the world Richard lived in, that made him a target. The real turning point came one fateful night when Richard received a call that would change everything. It was from an old associate, someone he had worked with in the past but hadn't heard from in years. The man on the other end of the phone spoke in a low, almost conspiratorial voice. "We need you, Richard," he said, his words dripping with urgency. "There's a job. A big one. But it's not like the others. This time, you're not just taking out a target. You're taking down the whole operation." Richard's interest was piqued, but something in the man's voice set off an alarm in his mind. It was too vague. Too urgent. And Richard had learned long ago that when things were rushed, it usually meant something wasn't right. But he needed the work. And in his mind, no matter how dangerous it was, he was always the one in control. He accepted the job, though a small voice in the back of his head told him to be careful. The job was to take down a rising figure in the underworld, a man who had been challenging the old bosses and making waves across several states. The job seemed simple enough on the surface: eliminate the target, and the rest would fall into place. But as Richard delved deeper into the details, he began to understand that this wasn't just another hit. This was a setup. The target wasn't the only problem. The real problem was the people behind the contract. Richard had become a pawn in a much bigger game. Those who had once trusted him were now using him to eliminate one of their own, someone who had become a threat to the established order. And the deeper Richard went, the more he realized that he was being drawn into a web of lies and betrayal that would soon entrap him. The job wasn't about business anymore. It was about power, and Richard was no longer a player in the game. He was being played. As he prepared to carry out the job, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of the end. He had lived for so long without fear, without hesitation, but now he was facing something he couldn't control: the shifting allegiances of the people who had once been his allies. And in the criminal world, nothing was more dangerous than being caught between two sides. the night of the hit arrived, and Richard found himself in an unfamiliar situation. The target was a man he had never met before, someone whose name had been whispered about in the underworld but never directly associated with any major crime family. Richard wasn't sure what he was walking into, but he did what he always did. He moved carefully, methodically. The target was waiting in an old, abandoned warehouse, no guards, no backup. Just him, alone, surrounded by shadows. It should have been a simple kill. But as Richard moved in, everything changed. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a gunshot. Richard ducked instinctively, his heart racing. He had been set up. There were others in the warehouse, people who had been waiting for him, watching him, planning his downfall. The betrayal hit him like a freight train. He had been led here, like a lamb to the slaughter. But Richard wasn't going down without a fight. He fought back, taking out one of his attackers before making his escape. That night, Richard realized something he had been avoiding for years. His time was running out. The world he had known, the one built on control and fear, was no longer his to command. The Iceman, the man who had lived above the law, had become a target. And this time, there was no escape. Richard had barely managed to escape the ambush, but in the chaos, the message had been clear: the underworld was no longer a place where he could exist without consequences. The world he had carved out for himself was rapidly changing, and with it, the rules that had once kept him safe. The Mafia families, the people he had worked for and with for years, had begun to shift allegiances and rewrite the rules of the game. Richard was no longer at the top of his game. The world had moved on, and now, he was a relic of the past, a man who had outlived his usefulness. Richard's escape that night wasn't a clean one. He was forced to lay low for a while, moving from one safe house to the next, always looking over his shoulder. He knew that the men who had once called him a valuable asset now saw him as a threat. And the law? They were closing in. Richard had managed to avoid capture for years, but he knew that sooner or later, his past would catch up with him. The days turned into weeks, and Richard found himself growing more paranoid. His movements became more erratic, more cautious. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable, but now, everywhere he went, he felt eyes on him. His name had become infamous, not just among criminals but within law enforcement. The press had latched onto the story of the Iceman, a cold-blooded killer who had been active for decades, leaving a trail of death behind him. The headlines kept coming, each one painting a picture of a man who had escaped justice for far too long. Richard didn't care about the media. He cared about surviving. His family was the one thing he still held on to, the one thing that hadn't changed in his chaotic world. He couldn't afford to drag them into the mess he had created. For years, he had kept his criminal life separate from his home life, and now, more than ever, that separation felt crucial. But even that was starting to unravel. Barbara had started to ask questions that Richard couldn't answer. She could feel the distance between them growing, could see the strain in his eyes. It wasn't just the long hours or the absence that troubled her, it was the way Richard had begun to change. He was no longer the man she had married. He was a stranger. Richard had never been good at dealing with personal emotions. His life had always been one of control, and emotions were a weakness. But the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. His family life, once his escape, now felt like a burden. He couldn't keep the facade up forever. Barbara had become suspicious, asking questions about where he had been, what he had been doing. Richard tried to deflect, tried to reassure her, but the more he lied, the more distant he became. She could see it in his eyes, the same coldness he had shown to everyone in the criminal world. The breaking point came one evening when Richard returned home to find Barbara gone. She had taken the children and left. There were no threats, no dramatic confrontations. She had simply packed up and walked out, taking the life Richard had built for her and their children with her. It was a clean break, one that left Richard in the silence of his own thoughts. His family was gone, and the only thing left was the work, the very thing that had destroyed everything he had tried to protect. Richard didn't know what to do. His life, once filled with purpose and control, had become a series of frantic, disconnected actions. The Iceman, the legend, the untouchable killer, was now a man on the run. He couldn't go home. He couldn't trust anyone. The Mafia families that had once relied on him were now too busy with their own infighting to care about him. And the law? They were closing in. The phone call came late one night, a familiar voice on the other end. It was Dominic Poliphern, the man who had set him up in the warehouse, the man who had betrayed him. But this time, there was no cold, businesslike tone in his voice. Poliphern was scared. He was on the run, hiding from the same enemies that Richard had made over the years. He needed help. And for the first time in a long time, Richard hesitated. He didn't want to help Poliphern. He didn't trust him. But Poliphern knew something about Richard's past, something that could destroy him if it ever got into the wrong hands. Richard didn't respond immediately. He sat in the darkness, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He had been running for so long. He had spent his life avoiding the consequences of his actions, but now, he was face to face with them. His family was gone. His reputation was shattered. And the law was closing in, piece by piece. The Iceman had never been afraid of death. But now, for the first time in years, Richard was afraid of what might come next. The world he had once controlled had turned on him, and the walls he had so carefully built around his life had come crumbling down. The man who had once been untouchable was now just another criminal running from his past, hoping to survive long enough to see another day. Richard had always prided himself on being a survivor, but now, in the wake of losing his family and his freedom, he realized survival wasn't just about outliving others. It was about managing the fear, the isolation, the weight of knowing that every choice you made would eventually come back to haunt you. He had lived his life for so long in the shadows, carefully avoiding detection, making his hits clean, erasing all traces of his presence. But now, he found himself exposed, vulnerable, and on the run from both the law and the very people he had once worked for. Poliphern's call had been a wake-up call, a reminder that Richard was no longer in control. The underworld he had once navigated so easily had become a war zone. The Mafia families, which had once been organized and structured, were now crumbling from within, torn apart by power struggles and betrayals. The new players, the younger, more ambitious criminals, didn't care about the old ways. They didn't care about loyalty or discretion. They wanted power, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. Richard knew that the longer he stayed in hiding, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for him. He had made too many enemies, and his name had become synonymous with danger. But he couldn't go back to the world he had once known. The Mafia families no longer saw him as an asset, they saw him as a loose end that needed to be tied up. He wasn't the Iceman anymore. He was just a man trying to escape the consequences of his past. The FBI, too, was closing in. The agents had been building a case against Richard for years, piecing together the puzzle of his many killings. They had no hard evidence, nothing that could tie him directly to the murders, but they had the whispers, the rumors, the patterns of his behavior. And as time passed, their confidence grew. They were getting closer, and Richard knew it. His once untouchable reputation had faded, replaced by the reality of a man who had nowhere to run. One day, after days of moving from one safe house to the next, Richard found himself sitting in a dingy motel room on the edge of town. It was the first time in a long while that he had been alone with his thoughts. His hands were trembling, a rarity for him, and he didn't know what to do next. The phone call with Poliphern had been a turning point. Richard wasn't sure if he could trust him, but the thought of making one last job, the job that would either restore his power or destroy him completely, was something he couldn't shake. He spent the next few days planning, weighing the risks. The target was a powerful player in the new underworld, a man who had been making waves in the drug trade and threatening the stability of the Mafia. Richard wasn't sure who had put out the contract on him, but he knew this wasn't just about business anymore. This was about survival. This was about proving to himself that he wasn't finished, that he still had control. As Richard prepared for the job, he thought about his family again. Barbara, the children, the life he had once had, gone. The life he had sacrificed everything for was slipping through his fingers, and there was no way to get it back. He had built his empire on violence, but now, in the silence of the motel room, he realized that empire had crumbled. All he had left was the work. The work that had always been his escape, his reason for existing, but now felt like a prison. A prison that he couldn't escape from. The night of the job arrived, and Richard found himself standing outside the target's compound, the familiar tools in his hands. It was the same as it had always been. No emotions. No second thoughts. Just the job. He had done this 1,000 times before, but this time, something felt different. He couldn't explain it, but there was a weight in the air, a heaviness in his chest that wouldn't go away. The target was inside the compound, alone, and Richard knew this was his chance. The moment was perfect. As he crept through the shadows, moving closer to his target, his mind kept drifting back to his family, to everything he had lost. He had become a monster, a man who had chosen to live a life of violence and deceit. And now, it was too late to turn back. He reached the door to the compound, and with one final glance at the shadows behind him, he knew this was it, the last job, the one that would either make him or break him. He had to finish it. He had to finish it to prove that he was still the Iceman. That he was still in control. But as he stepped forward, a sound stopped him, a distant noise, a voice, a crack in the silence. And in that moment, Richard realized something he hadn't considered before. The job wasn't about power. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about proving himself. The job, the violence, the killing, it was all a way to run from something deeper. A fear he hadn't acknowledged in years. The weight of his choices pressed on him like a suffocating blanket. His life, his reputation, his family, it had all led to this point, and Richard knew, deep down, that there was no escaping the consequences of the path he had chosen. But the decision had already been made. Richard was already in motion. The Iceman couldn't stop now, even if he wanted to. The job had been clean, just like all the others. Richard knew exactly what he was doing, and he did it with the same precision and professionalism that had made him the Iceman. The target was gone, the job complete, and Richard was back in the shadows where he belonged. Yet, as he walked away from the scene, there was no sense of satisfaction, no sense of victory. There was only the hollow feeling that had begun to gnaw at him. For so long, Richard had been driven by control. Every job, every hit, was a testament to his ability to keep his emotions in check, to remain detached, to make the world around him bend to his will. But now, with each passing job, that detachment was starting to feel less like a strength and more like a curse. He had spent so many years pushing down his emotions, burying his conscience beneath layer after layer of cold logic, but it was starting to crack. He had always known that his life would catch up with him, but what he hadn't anticipated was how the world around him would begin to fall apart. The Mafia families, once united by tradition and blood, were now breaking apart. The old guard was either dead, imprisoned, or losing power, and the new generation of criminals was running amok. They didn't care about the old codes. They cared only about money, power, and status. They were reckless. And in their wake, Richard found himself feeling more and more like an outdated relic. As the underworld shifted, Richard's place in it became increasingly uncertain. He had spent decades being the go-to man for jobs that no one else could handle. But now, he was just another name, another player in a world that was rapidly changing. The people who once trusted him were now questioning him. And even his own fear, the thing that had kept him on top for so long, was beginning to feel like a weakness. He couldn't outrun time. He couldn't outrun the changes that were happening around him. Richard had always been a man who moved in silence, who stayed in the shadows, who kept his head down and avoided making waves. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't ignore the growing feeling that everything was catching up to him. He could hear the whispers now, not just from the criminals he had worked with, but from the law as well. The FBI was getting closer. The evidence was piling up. They had no direct connection to him, but they knew who he was. They knew what he had done. The media had latched onto his story, and Richard was no longer just a name in the underworld. He was a figure of public fascination, a chilling symbol of a life lived outside the law. The press dubbed him the Iceman with a sense of morbid curiosity, but in the back of Richard's mind, he knew that this attention wasn't a badge of honor, it was a death sentence. People in his line of work didn't become famous and survive. They got sloppy, made mistakes, and eventually, their time ran out. Richard didn't fear the law. What terrified him more was the sense of betrayal that had begun to seep into every corner of his life. His family was gone, his relationships strained, and the world he had once controlled was slipping away. He had spent so many years building a reputation on fear, but now, fear was what was driving him mad. One evening, as he sat alone in a dimly lit apartment, a knock came at the door. Richard stood up instinctively, his hand resting on the gun he kept at his side. He wasn't expecting anyone, and in his world, that was always a sign of danger. He opened the door to find a familiar face, one he hadn't seen in years. It was Dominic Polifron, the man who had set him up in the warehouse months ago, the man who had once been part of the circle of criminals Richard had trusted. Polifron looked different. He was nervous, shaking slightly, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected someone to burst through the door at any moment. Richard could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear that had been in his own for so long. Polifron was no longer the confident, calm figure Richard had once known. He was a man running from something, a man who had realized that there were no winners in the game they had been playing. "I need your help," Polifron said, his voice low and strained. "It's over, Richard. The whole thing is falling apart. They're coming for us." Richard didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. He had seen it coming. The chaos that had consumed the underworld was no longer something he could ignore. The power struggles, the betrayals, the greed, it had all led to this. Richard had once been at the top of it all, but now, he was a man caught in the middle of a storm he couldn't control. "What do you want from me?" Richard asked finally, his voice calm but filled with a tension he couldn't hide. "They're coming for you, Richard," Polifron said. "They know what you've done. They know who you are. You need to get out. Now." Richard's mind raced. He had been preparing for this moment for years, but now that it had arrived, he found himself unsure. Polifron's words echoed in his mind, but they didn't offer the sense of clarity Richard had expected. His life, once so carefully structured, had turned into a labyrinth of confusion, and Richard wasn't sure how to escape it anymore. Richard had always been the Iceman, a man who lived in the shadows, a man who controlled the chaos around him. But now, as the walls closed in, he realized that the chaos had finally caught up with him. There was no way out, no clean escape. The world he had built, the life he had led, was slipping through his fingers, and Richard Kuklinski, the man who had never shown fear, was left with nothing but the crushing weight of his choices. The days following Polifron's visit were a blur. Richard had always prided himself on his ability to move in the shadows, on his skill at staying one step ahead of the law and the criminals he worked with. But now, as he moved from one temporary safe house to the next, he felt the weight of his past closing in on him. There was no longer any room to hide. The walls were getting smaller, and Richard knew it. The law had been relentless in its pursuit, and the rumors in the underworld had only grown louder. Richard was no longer the feared Iceman, the quiet and efficient killer who operated without a trace. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the criminal world, a man who had once thrived on control, but now was nothing more than a fugitive running from his own life. Richard spent days planning his next move, but the truth was, he didn't have a plan anymore. The power he had once held so firmly in his hands had slipped through his fingers, and now all he had left was survival. He could feel it in his bones, the constant anxiety gnawing at him, reminding him that there was nowhere left to go. His connections in the Mafia had dried up. The new generation didn't care about old allegiances. They were after their own slice of power, and Richard was just a memory, a name spoken in hushed tones, a story that was losing its meaning. But even as the law closed in, even as the underworld turned its back on him, Richard couldn't bring himself to stop. He couldn't let go of the only thing that had ever given him purpose. The work. The job. It had been his whole life, and he wasn't ready to walk away from it, not yet. So when an opportunity came, an old contact reached out with a new job, Richard knew he had to take it. It was reckless, and it was dangerous, but it was the only thing that felt familiar. The job was simple: eliminate a rising figure in the drug trade, a man who had crossed the wrong people. Richard was used to these kinds of contracts: quick, efficient, clean. He wasn't used to hesitation. He wasn't used to second-guessing himself. But as he prepared for the hit, he couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of his mind. This was it. This was the job that would either redeem him or destroy him completely. As the night of the hit arrived, Richard found himself standing in front of the building, his hands shaking slightly. The target was inside, and Richard knew exactly what he needed to do. It was supposed to be a routine job, just another notch in his belt, but as he stood there, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the end. He had lived a life defined by violence, by control, by fear. But now, as he looked at the shadows around him, he realized that those same things had left him broken. He entered the building quietly, his heart beating faster than usual. This wasn't the cool, calm Richard Kuklinski of old. The Iceman who had once moved through the underworld without hesitation. No, tonight, he was something different. He was a man who had run out of options, out of time. The gun in his hand felt heavier than it ever had before. Every step he took toward the target felt like a step further into his own oblivion. Inside, he found the target alone, sitting at a desk. The man looked up, his eyes widening in shock as Richard stepped into the room. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Richard's hand tightened around the gun, but his body didn't move. The target was terrified, but Richard wasn't. He didn't hesitate. He didn't flinch. He pulled the trigger, and the man fell, a clean kill. The job was done. But as Richard stood over the body, something inside of him broke. He looked down at the man's lifeless body, and for the first time, he felt nothing. No satisfaction. No triumph. Just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. The violence, the killing, it all felt meaningless now. It was as though the work he had done for so long had finally caught up to him. And it had taken away everything he had ever cared about. He walked away from the scene, his mind numb, his thoughts racing. As he moved through the dark streets, he couldn't escape the feeling that his time was running out. The law was closing in. The underworld was moving on without him. His family was gone. Everything he had built, everything he had done, had led him to this moment. And there was no way to turn back. Richard had always been a man of control, but now, as he stood on the edge of the life he had known, he realized that he had no control anymore. The world he had once dominated was no longer his. The Iceman was no longer untouchable. And the worst part was that he knew it. The end had come, and there was nothing left for him to fight for. As Richard walked away from the life he had built, he knew one thing for certain: no matter how many jobs he completed, no matter how many lives he took, there would always be something left behind. Something that couldn't be erased. Something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The days that followed Richard's final hit felt like an endless blur of shadows and silence. He moved through his life as if in a daze, his every step weighed down by the crushing realization that he was no longer in control. The Iceman, the man who had once been feared by all, was now a shell of the person he had been. The streets, once his domain, felt foreign. The faces that once looked to him for guidance now saw him as nothing more than a relic of a past they no longer respected. Richard's reputation, once untouchable, had been tainted. The Mafia families no longer had a use for him. His name had become synonymous with the violence he had so carefully cultivated, and while his work had always been efficient, it no longer commanded the same respect. The world he had known was rapidly shifting, and Richard was left behind, clinging to the only thing he had ever known, the job. But even that was starting to lose its meaning. The thrill of the kill, the power that came with it, had faded long ago. Now, it felt like nothing more than a hollow, mechanical task, a job that had to be done, but no longer held the same significance. Each kill felt like an echo of the one before, a reminder of everything he had lost. The power, the control, the fear, all of it seemed so distant now. It was in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts, that Richard felt the weight of everything he had done. The family he had abandoned, the people he had hurt, the lives he had taken, all of it had built up over the years, and now, it was suffocating him. The Iceman, the man who had lived his life without remorse, was beginning to feel the consequences of his actions. The walls he had built around himself had come crashing down, and now, there was no place left to hide. The law was getting closer, and Richard knew it. The FBI had been tracking his movements for years, and although they had never been able to tie him directly to the murders, they were closing in. The network of informants, the surveillance, the increased pressure, Richard could feel it all. It was only a matter of time before they found a way to link him to the killings. He had always been careful, but now, even his carefulness seemed like a mistake. His time was running out. In the midst of this chaos, Richard found himself thinking about his family again. Barbara, the children, the life he had tried to protect, they were gone. Barbara had left him years ago, unable to live with the lies, the secrecy, the fear. His children were grown, and they had moved on with their lives. They had been given the gift of a life free from his world of violence, and while Richard had never wanted to drag them into it, he couldn't help but feel the loss. He had chosen his path, and now, it had taken everything from him. He had sacrificed them for his own selfish desire for power, and now, they were gone. The feeling of loneliness was something Richard had never truly experienced before. He had always been a solitary figure, a man who worked alone, who didn't need anyone. But now, in the quiet of his life, he realized how wrong he had been. The fear that had once driven him, the control he had once wielded, had all been a mask. Behind it, there was nothing. Nothing but emptiness. And yet, Richard couldn't stop. The work continued to come, and he continued to take it. He couldn't walk away from the one thing that had defined him for so long. He was too far gone, too entangled in the world of violence and crime to turn back now. The Iceman was a name, a legend, and Richard had become a prisoner to it. He had spent his life building this empire of fear, but now, he was just a man running from the consequences of his choices. One evening, as Richard sat in a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find a man standing behind him, someone he didn't recognize, someone who had no business knowing his name. The man didn't say anything at first, just stared at him, his eyes cold and calculating. Richard could feel the weight of the moment, a sense of inevitability hanging in the air. This was it. The end. He had known it was coming. He had known that sooner or later, his past would catch up with him. The man finally spoke. "I know who you are," he said, his voice low. "And I know what you've done." Richard's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, but the man didn't seem intimidated. He just stood there, waiting. Richard could feel the tension building, but there was no fear. Not anymore. He had lived his life with fear, with paranoia, with control, but now, all of that seemed pointless. What was the point of fear when you had already lost everything? The man's words were a reminder of the world Richard had created for himself. "It's over, Richard," he said. "You've been living on borrowed time for too long. The law's getting closer, and so are we." Richard didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the man. The world he had once controlled was now out of his reach. The Iceman was no more. The legend had faded, leaving only the man behind, the man who had chosen this life, and now, had to face the consequences. As the man turned and walked away, Richard realized that the end had finally come. The time for running, for hiding, was over. The life he had chosen had come full circle. And now, there was nothing left for him but the consequences of his actions.